My boyfriend's sister told me she ran the house and I was just the girlfriend. She went nuts when we got engaged. I started dating my boyfriend Owen 2 years ago. We met at a friend's barbecue and talked for 3 hours straight about everything and nothing. He asked me out the next day and we've been together ever since. Owen is kind and hardworking and treats me better than anyone I've ever dated. He owns a 3-bedroom house he bought before we met. He worked overtime for years to afford the down payment and he's proud of what he built. The only complication in our relationship is his sister Noreen. She moved in with Owen 5 years ago after her divorce. She was supposed to stay for a few months while she got back on her feet. 5 years later, she's still there. She doesn't pay rent. She doesn't contribute to utilities. She occasionally buys groceries, but only things she likes. Owen lets her stay because she's his sister and he feels guilty that her marriage fell apart. I understood that at first. Family is important and I didn't want to come between them. But Noreen made it clear from the beginning that she saw me as a threat. The first time I stayed over at Owen's house, Noreen watched me like I was a burglar casing the place. She asked how long I'd been dating her brother. She asked what I did for work and how much I made. She asked if I had my own place or if I was looking to move in with someone. Every question felt like an interrogation. When I left the next morning, she told Owen I seemed nice, but something about me felt off. He told me about it later, thinking it was funny. I didn't laugh. Over the next year, Noreen escalated her behavior. She rearranged things after I cleaned. She cooked elaborate meals on nights Owen and I had dinner plans so he'd feel guilty leaving. She interrupted us constantly when we watched movies or talked in the living room. She knocked on his bedroom door at random hours with questions that could have waited until morning. She made sure I never forgot she lived there too. Owen asked me to move in after 18 months together. I was excited until I realized Noreen wasn't going anywhere. Owen said she just needed a little more time. He said she was almost ready to get her own place. He said I needed to be patient because she was family. I agreed to move in because I loved him and I believed things would work out. The day I brought my first box of belongings to the house, Noreen pulled me aside. Owen was outside getting more boxes from my car. She stood in front of me in the hallway and spoke quietly so only I could hear. She told me this was her house. She said she'd been here for 5 years and I was just the girlfriend. She said Owen might own the property, but she ran the household. She said I could stay in his bedroom, but the rest of the house was her territory. She said if I tried to change anything or push her out, she would make my life miserable. Then she smiled and walked away like nothing happened. I stood there holding a box of my books, trying to understand what just occurred. The next 6 months were exactly what Noreen promised. Miserable. She criticized everything I did. She complained that I used too much hot water. She said my cooking smelled up the kitchen. She rearranged the groceries I bought so I couldn't find anything. She took over the living room television every evening and refused to share. She told Owen I was messy even though I cleaned constantly. She told him I was rude to her even though I barely spoke to her. She cried to him about feeling pushed out of her own home, even though nobody was pushing her anywhere. Owen always defended me when we talked privately, but he never stood up to Noreen directly. He said she was sensitive. He said she was still recovering from her divorce. He said I needed to give her grace. I gave her 6 months of grace. Then I stopped. I started by reclaiming space. Noreen had spread her belongings throughout the entire house like she was marking territory. I gathered everything of hers that was in common areas and put it neatly in her bedroom. When she complained, I told Owen I was just organizing. He thought that was reasonable. She couldn't argue without admitting she'd taken over rooms that weren't hers. Then I started cooking dinner every night. Noreen used to cook whenever she wanted Owen's attention, but now I got there first. I made his favorite meals and had them ready when he got home from work. Noreen tried competing, but Owen said he felt bad eating twice. She had to eat her meals alone while we ate together. Then I took over household management. I created a chore schedule and posted it on the refrigerator. I included Noreen on the list because she lived there rent-free and should contribute something. She threw a fit and said I had no right to assign her tasks. I told Owen it was only fair since I was contributing more than her despite moving in 5 years later. He agreed and told Noreen she needed to help out. That was the first time he ever set a boundary with her. Noreen started slipping. She couldn't handle having rules. She skipped her assigned chores and I pointed it out calmly. She made passive-aggressive comments and I responded with aggressive politeness. She tried to get Owen alone to complain about me, and I made sure we spent most of our time together. I wasn't fighting with her. I was just taking up space she assumed was hers forever. The breaking point came when Owen mentioned we'd been talking about getting engaged. I heard Noreen's footsteps stop in the hallway outside Owen's bedroom. We'd been sitting on the bed talking about engagement timelines and what kind of ring I might like. Owen was smiling and relaxed in a way he rarely was when his sister was home. Then Noreen pushed the door open without knocking. Her face went completely white like someone had drained all the blood out of it. Then red flooded her cheeks and neck. She stood there breathing hard and staring at us. Owen started to say something, but she cut him off by storming into the living room. We followed her because the alternative was letting her destroy something. She spun around and pointed at me. She said getting engaged would be the biggest mistake of Owen's life. She said I was obviously just using him for his house. Owen tried to calm her down, but she started screaming. She said I'd already pushed her out of her own home. She said now I was trying to steal her brother completely. Owen kept saying her name in this quiet voice like he was trying to talk down a wild animal. Noreen ignored him and kept yelling about how I'd ruined everything and turned him against his family. I stood there and didn't say anything because I knew anything I said would make it worse. Eventually, she ran out of steam and locked herself in her bedroom. Owen looked at me with this helpless expression. I told him we'd talk about it tomorrow and went to bed. The next 3 days were worse than anything Noreen had done before. She played music at 2 in the morning, loud enough that the bass shook the walls. I'd just fall asleep and then some terrible pop song would start blasting from her room. Owen went to her door and asked her to turn it down. She said she couldn't sleep and needed the music to relax. The second night, I got up at 6 for work and discovered she'd used all the hot water. The shower ran ice cold no matter how long I waited. When I came out of the bathroom, Noreen was in the kitchen making coffee like nothing was wrong. She asked if I slept well. I said fine and left for work without breakfast. That afternoon, Owen called me and said Noreen told him I'd been saying cruel things about his family. He said he knew it wasn't true, but he wanted to check in with me. I asked what specifically I was supposed to have said. He got quiet and admitted Noreen wouldn't give details. She just cried and said I was mean to her when he wasn't around. I started keeping notes on my phone. I wrote down the time when the music started and stopped. I noted when the hot water ran out and when I saw Noreen afterward. I wrote down what Owen told me about her complaints. I didn't know exactly what I was documenting, but I knew I'd need proof eventually. 2 weeks later, Owen took me to our favorite Italian place downtown. We'd been there on our 3rd date and went back every few months. He seemed nervous during dinner and barely touched his pasta. When the waiter cleared our plates, Owen reached across the table and took my hand. He said he loved me and wanted to spend his life with me. Then he pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was his grandmother's ring, a simple gold band with 3 small diamonds. I said yes before he finished asking. I wasn't going to let Noreen's manipulation control our relationship. We were both happy and excited talking about when we'd tell people and whether we wanted a long or short engagement. But I felt this tight knot in my stomach thinking about what came next. We drove home holding hands and making plans. Then we pulled into the driveway and I saw Noreen standing at the living room window. She was just standing there watching us. The curtain was pulled back and she had her arms crossed. Owen saw her too and his smile faded a little. I squeezed his hand and told him it would be okay. I didn't believe it, but I said it anyway. Owen wanted to tell Noreen right away. He said it wasn't fair to keep it from her. I suggested waiting until morning, but he insisted we do it that night. He asked her to sit down in the living room. I sat on the couch next to Owen, and Noreen took the chair across from us. Owen told her we were engaged. For a second, Noreen just stared at us. Then she started crying. Not quiet tears, but huge sobbing gasps like she couldn't breathe. She said Owen was abandoning her just like her ex-husband did. She said I'd turned him against his own family. She said she had nowhere to go because she couldn't afford to live alone. Owen looked devastated. He moved to sit next to her and put his arm around her shoulders. He told her nothing had to change immediately. He said she could stay as long as she needed. My stomach dropped when he said it. I knew we couldn't keep living like this. Noreen kept crying and saying she didn't know what she was going to do. Owen kept reassuring her and promising things would work out. I sat there watching him comfort her and felt completely alone. After an hour, Noreen finally went to her room. Owen looked exhausted. I told him I was going to bed and left him sitting there in the dark. I waited until I heard Noreen's door lock before I went back to the living room. Owen was still on the couch staring at nothing. I sat down and told him we needed to have a serious conversation. He nodded but didn't look at me. I explained as calmly as I could that I wasn't moving forward with wedding planning while his sister lived here rent-free and treated me like an intruder. I said this was supposed to be our home and I didn't feel welcome in it. Owen got defensive. He said Noreen was going through a hard time. He said I needed to be more understanding. I asked how long I was supposed to wait. He didn't have an answer. I told him he'd been avoiding this confrontation for years and it finally caught up with him. I could see recognition in his eyes. He knew I was right even though he didn't want to admit it. He asked what I wanted him to do. I said he needed to set a timeline for Noreen to move out and actually stick to it this time. He said he'd think about it. I told him thinking wasn't enough anymore and went to bed. The following week, we started looking at wedding venues online. I'd bookmarked a few places, and Owen seemed excited about a barn venue about an hour away. We scheduled a video tour for Saturday morning. Friday night, Noreen announced she was having the bathroom tiles replaced starting at 8 on Saturday. Owen asked if she could reschedule. She said the contractor was only available this weekend, and she'd been planning it for weeks. I knew she was lying, but I didn't say anything. Saturday morning, we took the video call in Owen's car in the driveway because the hammering inside was too loud. The venue coordinator kept asking if everything was okay. After that, Noreen inserted herself into every decision. She'd walk by while we were looking at venues and comment that they looked too expensive. She told Owen that spring weddings were cursed because her marriage fell apart in April. She scheduled loud projects during every video tour we booked. When we looked at photographers, she said they all seemed overpriced. When we discussed catering, she said nobody would come if we didn't serve her mother's recipes. I stopped arguing with her and started writing everything down. I kept a detailed log with dates and times and exactly what she said or did. Owen needed to see the pattern in writing because he couldn't see it happening in real time. 3 weeks into our engagement, Becca came over for coffee. Noreen was at work or wherever she went during the day. Becca and I sat at the kitchen table and she told me about running into Noreen at the grocery store. Becca said Noreen was driving a nearly new car, something silver and expensive looking. I asked when this was and Becca said 2 days ago. I knew Noreen told Owen she couldn't afford a car and had to borrow his for errands. After Becca left, I started digging. I checked social media and found posts from Noreen's coworkers tagging her at a downtown office building. I looked up the company and saw they were hiring for her position with a salary range that made my stomach turn. She was making more than Owen. I tracked her spending based on things I'd seen her buy and calculated she had to have significant savings. She'd been perfectly capable of affording her own place for at least 2 years. When Owen got home, I showed him everything I'd found. I pulled up the job listings and the social media posts and my notes about her spending. Owen sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. He looked sick. He said he'd been working overtime for months to cover household expenses. She'd been playing helpless while building a savings account and driving a car nicer than his. Saturday morning, I woke up to voices in the living room. I came out and found Owen's parents standing there with Noreen. Tabitha and Nolan both looked at me with these tight, disappointed expressions. Noreen had clearly been crying. Tabitha started talking about family bonds and being more understanding. She said Noreen was going through a difficult time and I needed to show more compassion. Nolan said Owen had responsibilities to his sister that came before his relationship with me. They talked for about 5 minutes while I stood there in my pajamas. Then I held up one finger and went to get my folder. I'd printed everything out and organized it with tabs. I came back and calmly presented my documentation of Noreen's behavior. I showed them the log of sabotage attempts with dates and times. I showed them the evidence of her actual financial situation, including screenshots of her salary range and her expensive car. I showed them the timeline of escalating behavior from the day I moved in until now. Tabitha's expression changed as she read through the pages. Nolan got quiet and stopped looking at Noreen. I didn't say anything while they read. I just let the evidence speak for itself. When they finished, Tabitha looked at Noreen and asked if this was true. Noreen started crying again, but it felt different this time. More desperate than sad. She said I was twisting everything and making her look bad. Nolan asked about the job and the car. Noreen said that was private and none of their business. Tabitha gathered up the papers and told Owen they needed to talk as a family. I went back to the bedroom and left them to it. That night, Owen's best friend Leonardo came over for what Owen called a guys' night. I went to Becca's place to give them space. When I came home around 11, they were both still sitting at the kitchen table with empty beer bottles lined up. Leonardo saw me and said he should go. Owen asked him to stay. Leonardo looked uncomfortable, but he sat back down. He told Owen something he said everyone in their friend group had known for years, but nobody knew how to bring up. He described how Noreen destroyed Owen's previous 2 serious relationships through the exact same pattern. She'd manufacture crises right when things got serious. She'd play the victim and make Owen choose between his girlfriend and his family. She'd sabotage plans and create constant conflict until the women gave up. Leonardo said he watched it happen twice before I came along. He said he'd hoped Owen would see it this time, but Noreen's manipulation had gotten more sophisticated. Owen sat completely still listening to his best friend explain that his sister had been controlling his personal life for years. Leonardo said everyone was afraid to say anything because they didn't want to cause family drama, but watching it happen again with me was too much. Owen didn't say anything for a long time after Leonardo finished. Then he thanked him for telling the truth and Leonardo left. Owen and I sat at the table in silence. The next morning, I laid everything out for Owen. I spread my documentation across the kitchen table next to the financial evidence and my notes from Leonardo's account. I explained the pattern of Noreen deliberately sabotaging his relationships to keep him focused on her. I showed him how she'd been capable of independence for years, but chose to stay and maintain control. I walked him through each piece of evidence and let him draw his own conclusions. Owen looked physically ill. His hands were shaking and his face had gone pale. He kept picking up different pages and reading them like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then something shifted in his expression. The guilt and confusion started changing into anger. Real anger. Not the frustrated helplessness I'd seen before. He said he needed to set a firm deadline for Noreen to move out. He said he needed to actually enforce it this time instead of letting her manipulate him into backing down. I asked if he was sure, and he said he'd never been more sure of anything. He said he'd wasted years enabling behavior that hurt both of them. He said it was time to stop. Owen called Noreen into the living room that evening, and I stood next to him because I wanted her to see we were united on this. She came in looking annoyed like we were interrupting her TV show, and sat down on the couch with her arms crossed. Owen took a deep breath and told her she had 60 days to find an apartment and move out. He said he would help with first month's rent and the security deposit, but the current arrangement wasn't working anymore and needed to end. Noreen's face went from annoyed to shocked to angry in about 3 seconds. She stood up and asked if I was behind this, if I'd been poisoning him against his own family. Owen said this was his decision, and he'd been thinking about it for a while now. Noreen switched tactics immediately and started crying. She said she couldn't believe her own brother was abandoning her just like her ex-husband did. She said she had nowhere to go and couldn't afford to live alone. Owen reminded her about her full-time job and the savings account I'd discovered. Her tears stopped pretty fast when she realized he knew about her money. She got cold then. Really cold in a way I'd never seen before. She told Owen he was choosing some woman he barely knew over his own sister who had been there for him his whole life. She said I would leave him eventually, and then he'd regret pushing away the one person who actually loved him. Owen's hands were shaking, but he held firm. He said the deadline was 60 days and that was final. Noreen looked at me with pure hate and said this wasn't over. Then she walked out and slammed her bedroom door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. Owen sat down heavily on the couch and put his head in his hands. I sat next to him and put my hand on his back. I told him I was proud of him even though I knew how hard that was. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said he hoped he was doing the right thing. I said he absolutely was, and we'd get through this together. The next few weeks were tense, but Noreen seemed to accept the deadline. She started looking at apartments online and even went to see a few places. Owen started to relax a little, thinking maybe she understood this was necessary. I stayed cautious because I knew Noreen better than that by now. She was planning something. I just didn't know what yet. Then, with exactly 1 week left before the 60-day deadline, Noreen developed mysterious stomach pains. She came out of her room one morning, doubled over and groaning. Owen immediately wanted to take her to the emergency room. I watched her carefully and noticed she was peeking at Owen's reaction through her fingers while she groaned. They went to the hospital and spent 4 hours there. The doctors ran tests and found absolutely nothing wrong. Noreen came home with pain medication and a referral to see a specialist. She told Owen she couldn't possibly focus on apartment hunting while dealing with this health crisis. She said she needed to concentrate on getting better first, and then she'd resume looking for places. Owen looked torn, and I could see him starting to waver on the deadline. That night, after Noreen went to bed, Owen suggested maybe we should give her more time since she was sick. I looked at him and said no. I told him this was manipulation, pure and simple. I pointed out how convenient it was that this mysterious illness showed up exactly 1 week before she had to leave. I reminded him that the doctors found nothing wrong and that Noreen had peeked at him through her fingers to gauge his reaction to her groaning. Owen wanted to believe me, but I could see the guilt eating at him. What if she really was sick and he forced her out anyway? What kind of brother would that make him? I told him we weren't resetting the deadline for a medical emergency that only showed up when deadlines approached. Noreen went to the emergency room 3 more times that week. Each visit lasted hours, and each time they found absolutely nothing wrong with her. She came home with different pain medications and more referrals, but no actual diagnosis. She spent most of her time in her room groaning loudly enough for us to hear. Owen looked exhausted from worry and lack of sleep. I was exhausted from watching this obvious manipulation play out while Owen struggled with guilt. The deadline came and went. Noreen was still in the house claiming she was too sick to move. Owen hadn't enforced the deadline, and I could see the pattern starting all over again. She manufactured a crisis. He backed down, and nothing changed. I couldn't do this anymore. I packed a bag one morning while Owen was at work and left it in my car. When he got home that evening, I told him I was moving out temporarily and staying with Becca until Noreen was actually gone from the house. Owen's face went pale. He asked what I meant, and I explained as calmly as I could. I said I loved him, but I wouldn't participate in this cycle anymore where boundaries got set and then dissolved the moment Noreen manufactured a crisis. I said I'd watched him back down from the deadline he set, and I understood why, but I couldn't stay and watch it happen again and again. Owen looked panicked. He said I couldn't leave, that we'd work this out together. I told him I wasn't breaking up with him, but I needed him to prove through actions that he was ready to prioritize our relationship. I said when Noreen was actually out of the house and staying out, I would come back. But until then, I was staying with Becca. Owen started crying and asked me not to go. I hugged him and said this was the only way he would actually follow through. Then I picked up my bag and left. I cried the whole drive to Becca's apartment. This was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I knew it was necessary. Becca opened her door and hugged me without saying anything. She'd been expecting this call for weeks. 2 days later, Owen showed up at Becca's apartment. I opened the door and he looked terrible. His eyes were red and puffy like he'd been crying for hours. His clothes were wrinkled like he'd slept in them. He looked exhausted and heartbroken and determined all at once. He told me he went through with enforcing the deadline despite Noreen's protests. He said he told her she had 1 week to be out, or he would start formal eviction proceedings. He said it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but he finally understood that enabling Noreen had hurt both of them and prevented her from building her own independent life. I asked if he was sure, and he nodded. He said losing me made him realize he'd been choosing his sister's comfort over our future for too long. He said he was done making that choice. I hugged him tight and felt him shaking. I told him I knew this was incredibly hard and that we'd get through the aftermath together. He held on to me like I might disappear if he let go. We stood in Becca's doorway holding each other while he cried. Becca gave us some space and went to her room. Owen told me everything that happened after I left. How Noreen's mysterious stomach pains disappeared the moment he told her the deadline was final. How she screamed at him for hours about what a terrible brother he was. How she called their parents and told them he was forcing her onto the streets while she was sick. How he stood firm anyway because he couldn't lose me. I told him I was proud of him and that this was the right thing even though it felt awful. Noreen's final week in the house was a nightmare. She stopped pretending to be civil and went straight to destruction. I came back to help Owen deal with the situation and immediately regretted it. The first thing I noticed was the smell of bleach coming from the laundry room. I opened the washing machine and found all my clothes soaked in pure bleach. Every single piece was ruined, covered in white spots and holes where the bleach ate through the fabric. Months of my wardrobe destroyed in one spiteful act. I showed Owen and he looked sick. Then we found the scratches in the hardwood floor. Deep gouges carved into the floor of the master bedroom like someone had taken a key or a knife and deliberately dragged it across the wood over and over. The scratches formed words. She'd carved traitor into the floor in letters 2 feet tall. Owen stood there staring at the damage to his house, the house he'd worked overtime for years to afford. The destruction went beyond my clothes and the floor. She'd smashed several dishes that belonged to Owen's grandmother, family pieces that had been passed down for generations. She left them broken on the kitchen counter where we'd find them. She poured something sticky down the bathroom drain that clogged it completely. She put holes in the walls of her bedroom. She broke the lock on the back door. Every day brought new damage and new evidence of how much she hated us. Owen documented everything with photos. He walked through the house taking pictures of each destroyed item and damaged surface. I watched him photograph his grandmother's broken dishes and saw something change in his face. For the first time, he looked genuinely angry at his sister rather than just disappointed or guilty. He said she'd crossed a line from manipulation into actual malicious destruction. He said this wasn't grief or fear anymore. This was deliberate cruelty meant to hurt us as much as possible. The week ended and Noreen refused to leave. She locked herself in her room and said she wasn't going anywhere. Owen stood outside her door and told her she had 1 hour to start packing or he was calling the police. She screamed that he wouldn't dare. He pulled out his phone and started dialing. She opened the door then and looked at him like she didn't recognize him. He told her the deadline had passed and she was trespassing in his house now. She said fine and went back in her room. But she still didn't pack. Owen went to the county courthouse the next morning and filed formal eviction paperwork. The clerk explained the process would take at least another 30 days and cost several $100s in legal fees. Owen signed everything and paid the fees without hesitation. He said he should have done this months ago instead of hoping Noreen would leave voluntarily. The clerk gave him a court date and instructions for serving Noreen with the eviction notice. Owen drove home and handed Noreen the papers himself. She read them and laughed. She said he was really going to drag his own sister to court over this. He said yes, he was. She told him their parents would be ashamed of him. He said they already knew everything and supported his decision. That made her stop laughing. She asked what he meant, and he said Mom and Dad knew about the destroyed property, the manipulation, and the refusal to leave. She went pale and locked herself back in her room. Over the next few days, Noreen started calling everyone she knew. She told her friends that Owen was kicking her out on the streets while she was sick. She told distant relatives that I'd stolen her brother and turned him against his family. She posted vague messages on social media about betrayal and family bonds. She carefully left out every detail about her behavior, her financial capability, and the destruction she'd caused. Some people believed her version and sent Owen angry messages. Others asked for his side of the story and stopped talking to Noreen when they heard the truth. The family drama spread wider than our house, and I felt guilty about that, even though none of it was my fault. My phone rang one afternoon and I saw Tabitha's name on the screen. My stomach dropped because I assumed she was calling to yell at me for breaking up her family. I answered and she asked if we could meet for lunch without Owen or Noreen present. I agreed cautiously and we met at a quiet restaurant the next day. Tabitha looked older than the last time I'd seen her, tired and sad. She ordered coffee and then apologized. She said she was sorry for initially taking Noreen's side and not understanding what was really happening. She explained that she and Nolan had been enabling Noreen's dependence since her divorce, because they felt guilty about her failed marriage. She said they thought they were helping her heal, but instead they'd been preventing her from moving forward with her life. She said watching Owen finally set boundaries had made them realize they needed to stop rescuing Noreen from the natural consequences of her choices. I didn't know what to say. I'd expected anger or blame, not an apology and self-awareness. Tabitha said she'd talked to Owen about everything, seen the photos of the destruction, and understood why the eviction was necessary. She said she and Nolan would help Noreen with moving costs, but they supported Owen's decision completely. She said she hoped I could forgive them for not seeing the situation clearly earlier. I told her there was nothing to forgive, and that I was just glad they understood now. We talked for over an hour about family dynamics and enabling and how hard it is to see manipulation when it comes from someone you love. Tabitha hugged me before we left and thanked me for not giving up on Owen. She said he needed someone strong enough to help him break the cycle. Nolan went to see Noreen a few days later. Owen told me about it afterward because Noreen called him screaming right after their dad left. Nolan sat down with Noreen in her room and told her that he and Tabitha would help her with moving costs. But they supported Owen's decision completely. He said they'd watched her manipulate Owen for years, and they were ashamed they didn't intervene sooner to encourage her independence. He said enabling her had seemed kind, but it had actually been cruel because it prevented her from building her own life. Noreen apparently told him he was choosing Owen over her just like everyone else was, Nolan said he was choosing what was healthy for both his children, even if Noreen couldn't see that yet. He said he loved her, but he wouldn't help her avoid the consequences of her choices anymore. Noreen told him to get out. But Owen said something shifted in her expression when she realized her parents weren't taking her side this time. Her usual support system had collapsed, and she was finally alone with the results of her own behavior. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning exactly 93 days after Owen first told Noreen she needed to leave. 3 months of manipulation, destruction, legal proceedings, and family conflict all leading to this moment. Professional movers loaded Noreen's belongings into the truck while she supervised without looking at either of us. She'd found a one-bedroom apartment across town, paid for partially by her parents and partially by her own savings, that she'd finally admitted existed. The movers worked efficiently, and within 3 hours, everything she owned was packed and loaded. Noreen got in her car without saying goodbye. She pulled out of the driveway and the moving truck followed her. Owen and I stood there watching both vehicles disappear down the street. The house was finally ours. Just ours. No more Noreen watching our every move. No more manipulation or sabotage or constant tension. Owen started crying. Not sad crying or happy crying, but this complicated mix of relief and grief and guilt all happening at once. He'd reclaimed his home but lost his relationship with his sister in the process. He'd done the right thing, but it still hurt. I held him in the driveway while he processed everything. His whole body shook and he cried harder than I'd ever seen him cry before. I didn't say anything, just held him and let him feel whatever he needed to feel. Eventually, he stopped shaking and pulled back. He looked at the house like he was seeing it for the first time. He said it felt different already, lighter somehow. I said that's what freedom felt like. The next 2 weeks were hard for Owen in ways I hadn't expected. He kept second-guessing himself and wondering if he'd been too harsh. He'd check his phone constantly to see if Noreen had texted. He'd suggest maybe we should drive by her apartment to make sure she was okay. He'd wake up in the middle of the night worried that she was struggling and needed help. The guilt came in waves and sometimes pulled him under completely. I reminded him gently each time that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, and that Noreen was a capable adult who needed to build her own life instead of living in his shadow. I said she'd been perfectly capable of independence for years, but chose dependence because it was easier and gave her control. I said letting her face the natural results of her choices was the kindest thing he could do for her long-term growth. Owen listened, but I could see him struggling to believe it. One particularly bad night, he said maybe we should invite her over for dinner, start rebuilding their relationship. I asked him if he thought she was ready for that, or if he was just trying to ease his own guilt. He admitted it was probably the guilt. I suggested we start couples counseling to work through the family dynamics and strengthen our communication skills. Owen agreed immediately, like he'd been waiting for me to suggest it. We found a therapist who specialized in family systems and boundary setting. Our first session was the following week, and it helped more than I expected. Just having a neutral third party validate that Owen's boundaries were healthy and necessary seemed to lift some of the weight off his shoulders. The first project we tackled was the master bedroom. Noreen had chosen the paint color years ago, this dull beige that made everything feel dark and cramped. Owen and I spent a Saturday afternoon at the hardware store picking out paint samples. We settled on a soft gray blue that made the room feel bigger and brighter. I painted while Owen pulled up the damaged flooring she'd scratched during her final week. We replaced it with new hardwood that matched the rest of the house. We moved the bed to a different wall and brought in a dresser from my old apartment that I'd kept in storage. Owen hung photos of us on vacation and with friends. By the end of the month, walking into that bedroom felt completely different. The space didn't hold any trace of Noreen's anger or the tension that used to fill every corner. Owen started sleeping better. He stopped waking up at random hours checking his phone for messages from her. I caught him smiling while folding laundry one afternoon and asked what he was thinking about. He said he was just happy to be home, really home, for the first time in years. We tackled the living room next. Noreen had arranged all the furniture to face the television she'd monopolized every evening. We moved the couch to create a better conversation area and added a reading chair by the window. I brought in plants and Owen built shelves for our books. We replaced her heavy dark curtains with lighter ones that let in more sun. The house started feeling like it belonged to both of us instead of being Noreen's territory that Owen happened to own. We cooked together in the kitchen without someone hovering and criticizing. We watched movies on the couch without interruptions. We had friends over for dinner without worrying about Noreen making everything awkward. The house felt lighter, calmer, like we could finally breathe properly. 2 months after Noreen moved out, Owen's phone buzzed during breakfast. He read the message and his face went carefully neutral. He handed me the phone so I could see. Noreen was asking if he wanted to meet for coffee. The text was different from her usual demands. She asked instead of telling him what to do. She suggested a coffee shop near her apartment instead of expecting him to come to her. She said she understood if he wasn't ready, but she hoped they could talk. Owen looked at me and asked what I thought. I told him it was his decision, but I wouldn't be upset if he wanted to see her. He texted back suggesting Thursday afternoon. Owen met Noreen at a small coffee shop across town. I stayed home and tried not to check the clock every 5 minutes. He was gone for almost 2 hours. When he came back, he looked tired but not upset. He sat down at the kitchen table and told me what happened. Noreen apologized. actually apologized without making excuses or blaming anyone else. She said losing control of his house forced her to look at herself honestly for the first time since her divorce. She'd been using him as a crutch and manipulating him to keep from facing her own life. She said she started seeing a therapist who helped her understand how dependent she'd become. She admitted she'd been horrible to me and to him. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted him to know she was working on herself. Owen told her he appreciated the apology, but needed time before they could rebuild any kind of relationship. He made it clear he wouldn't go back to their old dynamic where she controlled his life. Noreen said she understood. They agreed to have coffee again in a month if Owen felt ready. Wedding planning became easier without Noreen sabotaging everything. We looked at venues without someone criticizing every option. We chose a date in early October when the weather would be nice but not too hot. We booked a small garden venue that held about 80 people. Owen's parents were supportive and helpful. Tabitha took me shopping for my dress and we actually had fun together. She told me stories about Owen as a kid that made me love him even more. She apologized again for not seeing Noreen's behavior sooner. She said she and Nolan had enabled both their children in different ways and they were trying to do better. We invited Noreen to the wedding. Owen wanted to extend the invitation as a gesture of moving forward. I agreed because I could see it mattered to him. Noreen accepted with a text that sounded genuinely happy for us. She didn't ask to be involved in planning or try to insert herself into decisions. Owen and I set clear boundaries about her role. She could attend as a guest, but we weren't asking for her input or help. Tabitha became my main helper with wedding preparations. She had good taste and respected my opinions. She and I grew closer over the months of planning. I started to feel like I had a real relationship with Owen's mother, separate from all the drama with Noreen. Our wedding day arrived on a perfect October afternoon. The garden venue looked beautiful with fall flowers and warm sunshine. Noreen showed up on time wearing an appropriate dress. She congratulated us and didn't create any scenes, but I could feel the tension underneath everything. She stood apart from the family during photos. She left the reception early without saying goodbye to everyone. Owen's parents looked sad even while celebrating with us. I knew they were mourning the family harmony that might never fully return. I was genuinely happy walking down the aisle toward Owen. I meant every word of my vows. But I also knew our family dynamics would never be simple or easy. Noreen would always be Owen's sister. There would always be some level of complicated history and careful boundary management. We'd fought for our relationship and won, but the victory was messy and painful. Standing at the altar holding Owen's hands, I felt satisfied knowing we'd made it through the hard parts together. We were stronger for everything we'd survived. Our relationship wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. It was real and complicated and worth every difficult moment. My boyfriend ignored my miscarriage until the male EMT said, "If she were mine, I'd hold her close." He lost it. I was 11 weeks pregnant when sharp, stabbing pains had me crying and bleeding in our bathroom while my boyfriend William was in bed playing on his Switch with headphones on. I had to crawl to the bedroom and physically shake him before he noticed. "Something's wrong with the baby," I sobbed, blood already soaking through my pajama pants. He pulled one earbud out. "What do you mean?" "I'm bleeding. Bad. I think I'm losing the baby." He sat up slowly, annoyed, like I'd interrupted something important. "Are you sure? Maybe it's just spotting. Google says that's normal." I was curled on the bathroom floor passing clots when he finally called 911. Not because he was worried, but because I was being dramatic, and he wanted professionals to tell me I was overreacting. He actually said that to the dispatcher. When the EMTs arrived, William was back in bed. They found me alone on the bathroom floor, covered in blood, shaking. The younger EMT, Diego, immediately knelt beside me while his partner got the stretcher. "Hey, I'm Diego. We're going to take care of you, okay?" His voice was so gentle. "Can you tell me how far along you are?" 11 weeks, I managed through tears. Was our first." Diego squeezed my hand while his partner took vitals. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. Is your partner here?" William appeared in the doorway, fully dressed, keys in hand. "I'm going to follow in my car. Hospital parking is expensive, and I might need to leave early for work." Diego looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "Your girlfriend is having a miscarriage." "Yeah, well, these things happen. First trimester and all that." William shrugged. "Probably wasn't meant to be." I started sobbing harder. Diego immediately shifted to block William from my view, creating a protective barrier with his body. "Let's focus on getting you comfortable," he said to me, then looked at his partner. "Can you grab extra blankets from the truck?" She's in shock. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, Diego never let go of my hand. "I know this is devastating. You're being so strong." William followed us out, complaining about having to miss his buddy's poker night tomorrow because now we have to deal with this. He actually asked the EMTs how long miscarriages usually take because he had a conference call at 9 a.m. In the ambulance, Diego sat beside me while his partner drove. William had already left in his car. Diego held my hand the entire ride, talking softly about anything except what was happening. His dog, the weather, a funny call from last week. When I started crying again, he didn't tell me to stop or that everything would be okay. He just said, "This is a loss. You're allowed to grieve." At the hospital, William was in the waiting room on his laptop. Diego wheeled me in and stayed while they transferred me to a hospital bed. When the nurse asked if my partner wanted to come back, William said he was good where he was because the Wi-Fi was better in the waiting room. Diego was finishing his paperwork nearby. He looked at William, then at me, then back at William. "You know," he said, loud enough for the entire ER to hear, "I've responded to hundreds of miscarriages. The partners usually can't let go of their girlfriend's hand. They cry together. They grieve together." William finally looked up from his screen. Diego continued, adjusting his equipment bag. "If she were mine, I'd hold her close. I'd tell her it's not her fault. I'd make sure she knew she wasn't alone in the worst moment of her life." He paused. "But maybe I'm just old-fashioned about what love looks like." William slammed his laptop shut and stormed over. "Who the flock do you think you are?" "I'm the person who held your girlfriend's hand while she lost your baby," Diego said calmly. "You were checking work emails." "She's being dramatic. It's just a miscarriage." "Just a miscarriage?" I said from the bed. "It's our baby, William." He rolled his eyes. "It's not even a baby yet. It's like what, the size of a lime?" "Raspberry," Diego corrected quietly. 11 weeks is about the size of a raspberry. William turned on him. "How would you know that?" "Because I've had 3 miscarriages with my wife. I know every fruit size from blueberry to watermelon because we lost them at 8 weeks, 11 weeks, and 20 weeks. And every single time, I held her while she cried. I took time off work. I grieved with her." The entire ER had gone quiet. William's face was red, fists clenched. "Get away from my girlfriend." "Gladly." Diego looked at me. "You deserve better than someone who treats your loss like an inconvenience." That's when William fully snapped. He lunged at Diego, not caring how physically vulnerable I was, or how one wrong move would for sure kill our baby, and possibly even me. Security guards appeared from nowhere and grabbed William's arms mid-lunge, yanking him backwards so hard he stumbled. I screamed from the hospital bed, my voice coming out raw and broken as 2 more staff members rushed between William and Diego. The ER exploded into movement with nurses surrounding my bed and someone calling for the charge nurse while my whole body shook so hard the bed rails rattled. One nurse pressed her hand to my wrist, checking my pulse, while another adjusted the blood pressure cuff that suddenly felt too tight. My heart pounded in my ears and I couldn't stop shaking. Couldn't process that William had just tried to hurt someone right in front of me while I was bleeding and losing our baby. The head security guard positioned himself between William and the rest of us, his hand up in a stop gesture, while his partner kept a firm grip on William's shoulder. Diego stepped back with both hands raised in a calm, non-threatening position, his face neutral even though William was still yelling at him. The security guard asked Diego if he was hurt, and Diego shook his head no, his eyes briefly meeting mine with concern before looking away. William twisted against the guard's grip, his face red and splotchy as he shouted that Diego had disrespected him and everyone was taking my side. The partner pulled out a radio and reported the incident while the head guard took William's wallet from his pocket and wrote down his ID information. They told William he needed to wait in a separate area outside the ER, that he couldn't be near medical staff or patients right now. William's shouting got louder as they walked him toward the exit, his voice carrying back to where I lay frozen. He yelled that I was turning everyone against him, that this was all my fault for overreacting. His face was bright red with rage and something else, maybe embarrassment, as the automatic doors closed behind him. I felt my whole body go cold despite the heated blankets piled on top of me. I had just watched my boyfriend try to attack the person who held my hand while I lost our baby. The person who showed me more kindness in 2 hours than William had in 2 years. My teeth started chattering and I couldn't make them stop. The ER nurse came back to my bedside and placed her hand gently on my arm. She asked if I was okay while wrapping a fresh blood pressure cuff around my other arm. Her touch was so gentle it made me want to cry harder. She started an IV in my left hand, the needle pinch barely registering through everything else. She hung a bag of fluids and gave me something through the IV line for the pain, explaining they needed to do an ultrasound to see what was happening with the pregnancy. The medication made my head feel fuzzy but didn't touch the ache in my chest. She asked quietly who I wanted in the room with me during the exam. The question hung in the air between us. I realized with sudden sharp clarity that I didn't want William anywhere near me. Not now, maybe not ever. I told her I'd rather be alone and she nodded like this made perfect sense given what she'd just witnessed. She squeezed my hand and said she'd be right here the whole time. The ER doctor came in a few minutes later with a kind expression but serious eyes. She sat on the rolling stool beside my bed and explained that based on my symptoms and the amount of bleeding, I was likely having a miscarriage. Her voice was gentle, but she didn't sugarcoat anything. She outlined the next steps in simple terms I could understand through the fog. Ultrasound to confirm what was happening. Discussion of my options afterward. Blood work to check my hormone levels and something about my RH status that I didn't fully process. I tried to focus on her words but kept getting stuck on the phrase likely having a miscarriage. Like my brain couldn't move past it. My baby was probably already gone. My phone started buzzing on the tray table beside the bed. I picked it up and saw text after text from William. He said I was overreacting, that I'd embarrassed him in front of everyone, that the EMT had been out of line and I should have defended him, that people were staring at him in the waiting room. I stared at the messages that somehow made my physical pain and grief about his reputation. He didn't ask if I was okay or if the baby was okay, just complained about how this situation was affecting him. I set the phone face down without responding. The ultrasound tech arrived with her portable machine, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She was gentle and quiet as she squeezed gel onto my stomach and moved the wand across my belly. I watched her face while she looked at the screen. I saw it before she said anything. The way her expression shifted. Professional but sad. The doctor leaned in to look at the monitor and I heard her quiet sigh. The tech said softly that she was sorry. but there was no heartbeat. The doctor confirmed the pregnancy was not viable. I felt like I was falling through the bed into nothing. The room tilted and sounds got muffled like I was underwater. Someone was crying and it took me a second to realize it was me. The tech cleaned the gel off my stomach with warm towels while I stared at the ceiling tiles and tried to breathe. A different doctor arrived maybe 20 minutes later, introducing herself as Dr. Steele from OB/GYN. She pulled up a chair and sat at eye level with me instead of standing over the bed. She explained my 3 options in clear, straightforward language. I could wait for the miscarriage to happen naturally, which might take days or weeks. I could take medication to speed up the process, which would cause cramping and heavy bleeding at home. Or I could schedule a D&C procedure where they would remove the tissue surgically while I was under anesthesia. She explained each choice thoroughly, the risks and benefits of each approach. She mentioned they needed to check my blood type because of something called Rh factor that could affect future pregnancies. She described what aftercare would look like for each option. I tried to focus through the fog of grief that made everything feel distant and unreal. Dr. Steele didn't rush me or make me feel like I needed to decide right away. I thought about going home and waiting, not knowing when it would happen, dealing with the physical pain on top of everything else. I thought about taking medication and going through it at the apartment I shared with William. I couldn't handle either of those options. I told Dr. Steele I wanted the D&C, that I wanted it scheduled as soon as possible. Tomorrow morning if they could do it. She squeezed my hand and said that was a completely valid choice. She said they would make sure I was comfortable and supported through the procedure. She would do the surgery herself and she'd take good care of me. A nurse came back to check my blood pressure and asked if I needed anything for pain. I told her the cramping was getting worse, and she added something to my IV that made everything feel softer around the edges. Diego was still at the nurse's station filling out forms on a clipboard, and when I looked over, our eyes met for just a second. He gave me this small nod that somehow said he understood everything without needing words. Then he picked up his equipment bag and headed toward the exit with his partner. He didn't come back to the bed or try to talk to me again, just acknowledged what happened and left, and I felt grateful he knew not to make it weird or complicated. 2 security guards in Navy uniforms came to my bedside about 10 minutes later with a tablet and started asking questions about what happened with William. They typed everything into their incident report while the charge nurse stood nearby with her arms crossed. When they finished, the nurse sat on the edge of my bed and said a police officer could come take my statement if I wanted to document what William did. I felt this pull in 2 directions, wanting to protect myself but also not wanting to make everything bigger and messier. The nurse must have seen me hesitate because she said I should at least hear my options, that I didn't have to decide anything right now, but it helped to know what was possible. I told her okay, and she made a call from the phone at the nurse's station. Officer Hines showed up around 8 that evening. A tall guy maybe in his 40s with kind eyes and a notepad. He pulled a chair right up next to my hospital bed instead of standing over me, and he asked me to describe what happened in my own words. I told him about William lunging at Diego, about security grabbing him, about all the texts calling me dramatic. Hines wrote everything down and nodded while I talked, never making me feel stupid or like I was overreacting. He explained that William's behavior toward medical staff was taken seriously, that attacking healthcare workers was a crime, and he gave me a pamphlet about protective orders if I needed one later. He said I didn't have to do anything tonight, but I should keep the information because sometimes these situations got worse before they got better. My phone started buzzing on the tray table after Hines left. I picked it up and saw text after text from William. He said I was being dramatic for getting him in trouble. He said I embarrassed him in front of everyone by making that EMT think he was a bad boyfriend. He said the security guards treated him like a criminal when he was just defending his relationship. I stared at the messages that somehow turned his attempt to attack someone into my fault, that made his violence about my behavior. He didn't ask if I was okay or if the baby was okay or what the doctor said, just complained about how this situation made him look bad. I held the phone in my hand for a long time, reading the texts over and over, and then I turned it completely off and set it face down on the table. The D&C happened the next morning in a surgical suite with bright lights and machines that beeped. Dr. Steele was there in scrubs explaining each step before they put me under, telling me what to expect when I woke up, making sure I understood the aftercare. The anesthesiologist put something in my IV and told me to count backward from 10. I made it to 7. When I woke up in recovery, the physical pain was less sharp than before, just a deep ache and cramping, but the emotional emptiness felt huge and overwhelming. A different nurse gave me detailed aftercare instructions on printed sheets, a list of support resources including grief counseling numbers, and a card with my follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. She asked if someone was picking me up and I said yes, even though I hadn't called anyone yet. I used the hospital phone to call May instead of William. She answered on the second ring and I started crying before I could say anything. She told me she was leaving work right now and would be there in 20 minutes. When she arrived at the recovery area, she took one look at my face and just hugged me carefully, avoiding my stomach. I told her I couldn't go back to the apartment I shared with William, that I couldn't be there with him after everything that happened. She said I was staying with her as long as I needed, no discussion, and she'd already texted her roommate to set up the guest room. The nurse helped me get dressed in the clothes I'd worn 2 days ago, now wrinkled and smelling like hospital, and May held my arm while we walked slowly to her car. The first night at May's apartment, I lay in her guest room staring at the ceiling, even though the pain medication should have knocked me out. The bed was comfortable with clean sheets that smelled like lavender detergent, but I couldn't stop my brain from replaying everything. The physical cramping reminded me my body was recovering from losing a baby, from having the pregnancy surgically removed, and the silence in the room felt both safe and suffocating at the same time. I could hear May moving around in the kitchen, the quiet sounds of someone trying not to disturb me, and I felt grateful and guilty in equal measure. May made eggs and toast for breakfast, setting a plate in front of me at her small kitchen table. She suggested blocking William's number while pouring coffee, saying it casual like she was mentioning the weather. I picked up my phone and looked at the settings screen, my finger hovering over the block button, but I could only bring myself to mute his notifications instead of cutting contact completely. May didn't push or tell me I was making a mistake. She just nodded and said I'd know when I was ready, and I appreciated that she wasn't forcing me to move faster than I could handle. Officer Hines called that afternoon while I was sitting on May's couch. He explained how to document any contact from William, walking me through the process of screenshotting texts and keeping a log with dates and times. He described how to request a protective order if William's behavior continued, what evidence I'd need, what the court process looked like. I wrote down everything he said in a notebook May gave me, feeling less helpless when I had concrete steps I could take instead of just waiting to see what William would do next. My manager called around 3 asking how I was doing, and I arranged medical leave using the note Dr. Steele had given me. I tried not to cry while explaining I needed time to recover physically and emotionally, that I wasn't sure exactly how long, but at least 2 weeks to start. The manager was understanding and said, of course, take the time I needed, but then mentioned they'd have to redistribute my projects to other team members. I felt guilty for creating problems at work, even though I knew logically this wasn't my fault, that losing a baby and dealing with everything that happened wasn't something I chose. The next morning I called the number Officer Hines had given me for therapists who take my insurance. The receptionist asked what I needed help with, and I had to pause because saying it out loud made it real again. I told her I lost a pregnancy and needed someone who understood that kind of grief, plus relationship stuff. She was quiet for a second in a way that felt kind instead of awkward, then said she had an opening with Gardenia Wallace next Tuesday if that worked. I wrote down the date and time in shaky handwriting, and when I hung up I felt like I'd done something right even though my hands were shaking. 2 hours later my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Dr. Steele's office wanted to schedule my follow-up appointment for 2 weeks out. The nurse went through a list of warning signs I should watch for. Heavy bleeding that soaked through more than 1 pad an hour. Fever over 100. 4 degrees. Severe pain that didn't respond to the medication they'd given me. I grabbed the notebook May had left on the coffee table and wrote everything down, adding the appointment to my calendar app with 3 separate reminders. Having these medical checkpoints marked felt like something solid I could hold on to when everything else kept shifting under my feet. 4 days after the miscarriage, I was lying on May's couch in sweatpants when the intercom buzzed. May was in the kitchen making lunch and I heard her answer it. Her voice changed immediately, going flat and firm in a way I'd never heard before. She told someone they needed to leave. My whole body went cold because I knew it was William even before she said his name. He was demanding to talk to me, his voice coming through the speaker angry and entitled like I was being unreasonable. May repeated that I wasn't available and he needed to leave the property. She didn't yell or get emotional, just stated it like a fact. I was frozen on the couch with my heart beating, so hard I thought I might throw up. William kept arguing through the intercom, saying this was ridiculous and I was being dramatic. May pressed the button one more time and said if he didn't leave she was calling the police. Then she let go without waiting for his response. She came back into the living room and found me curled up with my knees to my chest. She sat down and pulled out her phone, opening her notes app. She typed in the date, time, and what happened, exactly like Officer Hines had told us to do. Then she asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though I wasn't, because what else could I say? That night I couldn't sleep again. I kept thinking about William standing outside the building, about how he'd shown up like he had a right to me. I got up around 2 a.m. and found the folder the hospital advocate had given me. Inside was information about therapy and support groups, plus the intake paperwork Gardenia's office had emailed me. One section asked about coping strategies and mentioned journaling as a way to process things. I found a blank notebook in May's guest room desk and opened it to the first page. I wrote the date at the top. Then I started writing about what happened, starting with the bathroom floor and the blood and William not noticing. The words came out messy and I had to stop 3 times to cry, but I kept going. I wrote about Diego holding my hand in the ambulance, about William trying to attack him in the ER, about losing the baby and feeling like my body had failed at the one thing it was supposed to do. When I finally stopped, my hand was cramping and I'd filled 6 pages. I felt raw and exhausted, but also like I'd let something out that had been trapped inside my chest. Tuesday came and I took the bus to Gardenia's office in a building downtown. The waiting room had soft gray walls and plants in the corners. A woman about my age came out and introduced herself as Gardenia, shaking my hand gently. Her office had a couch and a chair, warm lighting that wasn't too bright, and a box of tissues on the side table. She told me to sit wherever I felt comfortable and I chose the couch. Then I just started crying. I couldn't help it. She didn't try to stop me or make it better, just sat quietly and pushed the tissue box closer. After maybe 10 minutes, I managed to say I didn't know where to start. She asked what brought me here, and I told her about the miscarriage, about William's reaction, about feeling like I was drowning. She listened without interrupting, nodding sometimes, but mostly just letting me talk. When I finally ran out of words, she said something that made me feel less crazy. She said losing a pregnancy isn't just losing what is, it's losing what you thought would be. All the future you'd already imagined. She said grief for that is real and valid. Then she handed me a worksheet about boundaries and said we'd work on this together. Looking at the questions on the page felt both obvious and like someone had just handed me a map I didn't know existed. 2 weeks after the D&C, I went back to Dr. Steele's office for the follow-up. The nurse took my blood pressure and temperature, asked about my bleeding and pain levels. Dr. Steele came in and did a quick exam, checking that everything was healing right. She said my physical recovery was going well, that my body was doing what it needed to do. Then she asked how I was doing emotionally and if I had support. I told her about staying with May and starting therapy. She asked if I was feeling guilty about the miscarriage, and I nodded because that feeling sat in my stomach all the time. Dr. Steele looked right at me and said firmly that nothing I did caused this. Not stress, not exercise, not anything. She said first trimester miscarriages usually happen because of chromosomal issues, problems that started at conception. We talked about fertility and whether I'd want to try again someday. She didn't push or make promises, just explained what the medical reality looked like. When I asked if my body would be able to carry a pregnancy in the future, she said probably yes, but there were no guarantees. I appreciated that she didn't try to make me feel better with fake reassurance. The next evening, May came into the living room where I was folding laundry and held out her phone. She'd screenshot a group chat with some of our mutual friends. William had written a long message about how the pregnancy wasn't a big deal since it was so early. He said I was being dramatic about what happened at the hospital. He claimed Diego had provoked him, and he'd just been defending himself. Reading his words made something shift in my chest, something that had been soft going hard. He was rewriting what happened, making himself the victim, erasing our baby like it had never mattered. I scrolled through the rest of the messages. A few people had pushed back gently, but most had just moved on to other topics. I handed the phone back to May and she asked if I was okay. I said I was done making excuses for him. I meant it. The next morning I called the police non-emergency line. I explained I needed to get my things from the apartment I'd shared with my ex, but I had a safety concern. The operator took my information and said someone would call me back. 3 hours later, my phone rang and it was Officer Hines. He remembered me from the ER and asked how I was doing. I told him I needed to get my documents and clothes from the apartment, but I was scared to face William alone. He said they could arrange a standby, where officers would be present while I collected my belongings. We set it up for the following Tuesday afternoon. He asked if I had somewhere to store everything, and I said yes. May had space. Hanging up, I felt my hands shaking, but also felt like I was taking control of something instead of just letting things happen to me. That afternoon, my manager called. She said she'd approved extending my medical leave another 2 weeks. I felt relief flood through me because I wasn't ready to go back yet. Then she mentioned they were concerned about some project deadlines, that my absence was creating problems for the team. I apologized and she said it was fine, these things happen, but I could hear the stress in her voice. After we hung up, I sat there feeling guilty for needing time to recover, guilty for making work harder for other people, guilty for everything. I knew logically that losing a baby and dealing with William wasn't something I chose, but knowing something logically and feeling it are different things. A few days later, I was making coffee in May's kitchen when she brought in the mail. She handed me an envelope forwarded from the hospital with my name on it. Inside was a card with a simple design, signed by the EMT department. It said they were thinking of me during this difficult time. I stared at it for a long moment. These people had seen me at my absolute worst, covered in blood and losing my baby. They didn't have to send anything. They'd already done their job. But they'd taken time to acknowledge what happened, to say they cared. I started crying, but it felt different from the other crying I'd been doing. This wasn't grief or anger. It was something else. Something about strangers being kinder than the person who was supposed to love me. That night, I sat at May's kitchen table with a blank page from a notebook and a pen that kept shaking in my hand. I started writing to the baby I'd lost, telling them about the nursery I'd imagined with soft yellow walls and the mobile with little stars I'd seen online. I wrote about how I'd planned to read to them every night and take them to the park on Sundays and teach them to bake cookies when they got older. I wrote that I was sorry I couldn't protect them, that my body had failed them, that they deserved better than what happened. The words poured out for 3 pages until my hand cramped and tears blurred the ink. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my journal where no one would see it. Getting those thoughts out of my head and onto paper felt like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying since the hospital. The next morning, the hospital advocate called to schedule a meeting about safety planning. Her office was in the same building as the ER, but in a quieter wing with plants and soft chairs. She introduced herself and pulled out a folder with information about protective orders. She explained the process step by step, how to file the paperwork, what evidence would help, what the hearing would look like. She asked me to think through different scenarios where William might try to contact me and helped me plan responses for each one. She talked about changing my routines, varying my routes to work, being aware of my surroundings. Her tone was practical without being scary, treating this like a problem we could solve together with the right tools. She gave me a folder thick with resources and phone numbers and walked me through each document. When I left her office, I felt less helpless because I had concrete steps I could take. That night, I woke up gasping in May's guest room at 3 in the morning. In the nightmare, William had reached Diego, and it was my fault because I'd caused the confrontation by being dramatic. I sat up shaking and disoriented, not sure where I was for a few seconds. May knocked softly and asked if I was okay. I told her about the nightmare, and she made me tea and sat with me until my breathing slowed. In my next therapy session with Gardenia, I mentioned the nightmares. She taught me grounding techniques, having me name 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear. She explained that trauma doesn't follow a logical timeline, that my brain was processing what happened in the only way it knew how. She gave me tips for sleep hygiene and suggested keeping a small light on at night. The validation that my nightmares were normal helped somehow. Over the next few days, my phone kept buzzing with messages from mutual friends. William had posted vague things on social media about betrayal and false accusations. People were asking me what happened, if I was okay, if the stuff William was saying was true. I responded to 2 people with brief messages saying I wasn't discussing this and asking them to respect my privacy. Then I deactivated all my accounts because the attention felt like too much when I was trying to focus on healing. Logging out felt like closing a door on noise I didn't need. The court date for the protective order hearing arrived faster than I expected. I'd spent the week before preparing paperwork with Officer Hines' help over the phone. We outlined the hospital incident, William showing up at May's building, the emails he'd sent. Hines walked me through what to expect in the courtroom, who would be there, what questions the judge might ask. He reminded me I had documentation and witnesses. I was still nervous about facing William in court, but having Hines explain the process made it feel less scary. May took the morning off work to come with me. We sat in the courthouse hallway on a hard bench waiting for my case to be called. She told me a story about her cat knocking over a plant at 2 a.m. and the mess she'd woken up to. I laughed for the first time in days. Her presence steadied me when I started feeling shaky. I realized how important it was to have someone who just showed up without needing thanks or explanation. When we stood up to go inside, William was suddenly there in the hallway. He walked toward me with sad eyes and his hands out like he wanted to hug me. He started to say he was sorry and could we please talk. I remembered what the hospital advocate had told me about maintaining boundaries. I told him I couldn't talk to him and walked past him toward the courtroom. He called after me that I was being unreasonable. I had to fight the familiar urge to turn around and comfort him and explain myself. Inside the courtroom, the judge reviewed the hospital security report and the medical notes from Dr. Steele and my written statement. She asked me a few questions about the incidents and whether I felt unsafe. I answered as clearly as I could. William tried to interrupt twice, and the judge told him to wait his turn. After reviewing everything, she granted a 6-month protective order. William's face went bright red as the judge explained the terms, what he couldn't do, the consequences if he violated it. I felt both relief that I was protected and a weird letdown that this huge moment was over in 15 minutes. Outside the courthouse, my hands wouldn't stop shaking even though I'd gotten what I came for. May guided me to a bench in the sun where I could breathe. She didn't tell me it was over or that everything was fine. She just sat beside me while my nervous system caught up to the fact that I was safe. 3 days later, the police standby happened. 2 officers met me at the apartment William and I had shared. They waited by the door while I packed essentials into boxes and trash bags. I moved through the rooms quickly, grabbing clothes and documents and the few things that were just mine. In the bathroom, I opened the drawer to get my toothbrush and found a receipt for the prenatal vitamins I'd bought 2 months ago. I sat down on the bathroom floor and cried for 5 minutes while the officers waited patiently. Then I wiped my face, finished packing, and walked out the door without looking back at the apartment where I'd thought I was building a life. Breaking the lease took 3 visits to the landlord's office and a check for $800 that made my stomach hurt to write. I sat across from the property manager while she printed out the release forms and explained the early termination fee in detail, like I hadn't already read the lease a dozen times. My hand shook when I signed my name on the line, removing me from the paperwork. The manager stamped the documents and handed me a copy, and I walked out knowing I'd just paid nearly a month's rent to never see William again. Back at May's apartment, I spread out my bank statements on her kitchen table and stared at the numbers until they blurred. May came home from work and found me there, pulled up a chair and opened a budgeting app on her phone. She walked me through setting up categories for rent, food, medical bills, and eventually my own place. I watched the numbers organize into something manageable and felt proud of myself for choosing safety, even though it cost me money I didn't really have. Therapy with Gardenia the following week focused on patterns I'd been avoiding seeing. She asked me to describe a typical argument with William, and I started explaining how I'd always tried to stay calm so he wouldn't get more upset. Gardenia stopped me there and asked how often I'd minimized my own feelings to manage his emotions. I opened my mouth to defend myself and realized I'd been doing exactly that for years. She didn't make me feel stupid for staying or blame me for not seeing it sooner. She just helped me understand the pattern so I could recognize it and make different choices going forward. I left that session feeling like someone had turned on a light in a room I'd been stumbling through in the dark. The OB clinic lobby was busy when I arrived for my regular follow-up 2 weeks later. I checked in at the desk and found a seat near the window, flipping through a magazine without really reading it. Diego walked in carrying a to-go coffee cup and stopped short when he saw me. We both hesitated for a second before I stood up and crossed the small space between us. I thanked him for the kindness the EMTs showed me that night, keeping it general and not making it weird. He smiled and said they were just doing their job, then mentioned his wife had an appointment here too, which explained why he was in the building. The way he said it felt natural rather than pointed, and I appreciated that he wasn't trying to be my hero or my friend. We talked for maybe 2 minutes before his wife came out of the restroom and he excused himself. I sat back down feeling okay about the encounter, like we'd acknowledged what happened without making it into something bigger than it needed to be. May helped me load the baby items into her car the next Saturday morning. I'd only bought a few things before the miscarriage, a pack of onesies and a stuffed elephant and some books I'd been excited about reading someday. We drove them to a pregnancy support organization downtown and carried the bag inside together. The volunteer at the desk thanked us and asked if we wanted a receipt for taxes, and I said no, because I didn't want documentation of this loss sitting in a file somewhere. Back at May's apartment, we lit a candle on her coffee table and sat on the couch watching it flicker. It was a small ritual that acknowledged what I'd lost without trying to make it mean something bigger than it was. May didn't say anything profound or try to find a silver lining. She just sat with me while the candle burned down, and I felt grateful she understood I needed to mark this without drama. My first day back at work was a Monday morning 3 weeks after the miscarriage. My manager had created a ramp-up plan starting with easier projects to rebuild my confidence. I sat at my desk opening emails and reviewing spreadsheets while my coworkers welcomed me back with careful smiles. The project I started was straightforward data entry that didn't require much creative thinking. Around 2 in the afternoon, I felt tears building and had to lock myself in the bathroom for 5 minutes. I splashed cold water on my face and went back to my desk. At 4 o'clock, I nearly cried again when a coworker asked how I was doing in that careful tone people use when they know something bad happened. I made it through the whole day and felt a tiny bit of normalcy returning to my routine. The email from William arrived Wednesday morning from an address I didn't recognize. He asked if we could talk and complained that the protective order was making his life difficult. My hands started shaking as I read it, but I remembered the safety plan Officer Hines had helped me create. I took a screenshot of the email without responding, opened a new message to Hines, and forwarded everything with a brief note about the violation. My heart raced while I clicked send, but I also felt proud that I'd followed the plan instead of engaging with William's manipulation. HR called me in for a meeting the next day to update my emergency contacts and discuss building security. I removed William's name from every form and added May instead. The HR representative explained they were adjusting my building access badge and that security would get William's photo so they could prevent him from entering the workplace. We walked down to the security desk together where I pulled up a photo of William on my phone. The guard made a copy and added it to their system. These practical measures made me feel slightly safer, even though I hated needing them in the first place. Gardenia noted progress in our next therapy session. She pointed out that my hypervigilance was decreasing based on what I described about sleeping better and not jumping at every sound. We talked about moving to appointments every other week instead of weekly. The progress felt fragile but real, and I was learning to trust that healing didn't have to be linear to be happening. She gave me homework about identifying my needs versus others' expectations, and I left feeling like I was building something sustainable rather than just surviving. My final OB follow-up with Dr. Steele happened on a Thursday afternoon. She did an exam and reviewed my lab results, then told me everything looked good, and there were no complications from the miscarriage. She cleared me medically while acknowledging that the emotional recovery would take longer than the physical healing. She asked if I had support for the grief piece, and when I mentioned therapy with Gardenia, she nodded and said that was exactly what she wanted to hear. She wished me well as I left, and I felt a chapter closing, even though I knew the story wasn't over. May's lease renewal notice came in the mail the following week. We were sitting on her couch when she opened it and mentioned she needed to decide about staying another year. I offered to increase my contribution to rent, signaling that I was planning to stay longer term rather than finding my own place right away. She accepted without making a big deal about it, and we joked about being roommates like we were in college again. Underneath the humor was the serious reality that she'd given me stability when I needed it most, and I was grateful to have a place where I felt safe while I figured out the rest of my life. Officer Hines called the following week while I was at May's apartment folding laundry. He explained that the prosecutor had reviewed William's case but decided not to file additional charges beyond the protective order violation warning. I felt my chest tighten with frustration as he talked, disappointed that William faced such limited consequences for everything he'd done. Hines walked me through the legal reality of what they could actually prove in court, explaining that emotional abuse and being a terrible partner weren't crimes, even though the hospital incident was documented. I appreciated his honesty instead of making false promises about justice, and I thanked him for following up personally when he didn't have to. He reminded me the protective order was still in place, and to keep documenting any violations, then wished me well before hanging up. I sat there staring at my phone for a few minutes, processing the anger and disappointment before going back to the laundry. The pregnancy loss support group met Thursday evenings at a community center across town. I drove there the next week, walking into a room with folding chairs arranged in a circle and 8 other women already seated. The facilitator introduced herself and explained the format where we'd go around sharing our stories and feelings. I listened to the first few women talk about their losses, noticing how the structure felt too formal and the sharing too prescribed for what I needed right now. When my turn came, I gave a brief version of my miscarriage without mentioning William or the ER drama, and the facilitator asked probing questions about my support system that felt invasive. After the meeting ended, I drove home knowing I wouldn't return. Individual therapy with Gardenia was working better for me, and I didn't feel guilty about that choice because I was learning that different people heal differently. I texted May that I'd tried the group but it wasn't my thing, and she responded with a thumbs up and no pressure. I spent Saturday morning at May's kitchen table drafting a thank you note to Diego for his compassion during the worst night of my life. I wrote and rewrote it several times, trying to express gratitude without being weird or crossing boundaries. The final version was simple, thanking him for his kindness and professional care, acknowledging how much his compassion meant during a traumatic experience. I addressed it to the hospital's general feedback system, rather than trying to contact him directly, finding their online form and submitting it through proper channels. It felt important to express gratitude while respecting the boundaries he'd maintained throughout everything. I hoped he would see the feedback and know his kindness mattered, even if I never heard back. Clicking submit gave me a small sense of closure, like I'd honored something important without making it complicated. My work required CPR certification renewal, so I signed up for a public class at the community center 2 weeks later. I walked into the training room and immediately recognized Diego at the front setting up practice dummies. My stomach flipped, but I took a seat in the back row, hoping to avoid awkward interaction. During the morning break, he approached me with a friendly smile and asked how I was doing. I told him I was managing, that I had good support and was in therapy. He nodded and said he was glad to hear it, then mentioned his wife was pregnant again, which made me genuinely happy for him. I congratulated him and asked when they were due, and we chatted briefly about his excitement mixed with normal pregnancy anxiety. The conversation felt grounded in mutual respect, rather than anything complicated or charged. When the break ended, we returned to our spots, and I felt okay about the encounter, like we'd acknowledged our connection without making it into something it wasn't. My next therapy session with Gardenia focused on untangling my feelings about Diego. She helped me understand that my attraction to him was really about feeling safe and seen during trauma, not about him specifically as a person. We talked about the difference between genuine connection and trauma bonding, between real attraction and the desperate need to be rescued. She asked me to consider what Diego represented in that moment, how his basic human decency had felt like heroism, because William's cruelty was my normal. Something clicked as we discussed releasing the fantasy of being rescued, and building my own sense of security instead. I realized I'd stayed with William for so long partly because I kept hoping he'd transform into someone who cared, waiting to be saved instead of saving myself. Gardenia gave me homework about identifying moments when I'd given away my power and how to reclaim it. I left the session feeling like I'd understood something fundamental about my patterns. Apartment hunting became my focus over the next few weeks. I found a small studio closer to work, nothing fancy but clean and affordable with my own kitchen and bathroom. I used the savings I'd been keeping separate from William, plus a loan from my parents who were relieved I was finally leaving him completely. May helped me move in on a Saturday, loading her car with my belongings from her guest room, and the few things I'd retrieved from the old apartment. We made 3 trips, carrying boxes up 2 flights of stairs and arranging furniture in the tiny space. Having my own place with locks only I controlled felt like reclaiming something essential about myself. May ordered pizza for dinner, and we sat on my new floor eating from the box, joking about my minimalist setup. After she left, I stood in the middle of my empty studio and felt proud of myself for getting here. Closing the joint bank account with William required one last interaction through email. I logged in and saw we had one final shared bill to pay, then drafted a message about splitting it and closing everything. William responded with a dispute about who owed what, claiming I'd used more utilities the last month, which was ridiculous since I'd moved out. We went back and forth through terse emails for 2 days before I just paid the extra $20 myself to be done with it. The annoyance of dealing with financial loose ends was nothing compared to the relief of finally being financially separate. I transferred my half of the remaining balance, closed my access to the account, and deleted all his payment apps from my phone. Seeing those apps disappear from my screen felt like erasing another connection between us. I reactivated my social media accounts after 2 months of being offline, but I set much tighter privacy settings and made a clear policy about not discussing the miscarriage or breakup publicly. A few people immediately messaged asking what happened with William and if I was okay. I declined to answer the intrusive questions with a simple response that I was handling things privately. Some people pushed harder, wanting details or offering unsolicited advice, and I was surprised by how okay I was with disappointing their curiosity. I unfollowed anyone who made me feel obligated to explain myself and kept my feed limited to close friends and family. Being back online felt manageable now that I'd learned to protect my boundaries even in digital spaces. The date circled on my calendar arrived in early summer. It would have been my due date, the day I would have met my baby if everything had gone differently. I took the day off work without explaining why, just marking it as personal time. I spent the morning alone in my studio, lighting the same candle I'd used before, and reading the letter I'd written to the baby months ago. I let myself cry without trying to stop or analyze it, just sitting on my floor grieving what I'd lost. May texted around lunch to check on me but didn't hover or demand details, just sent a heart emoji and said she was around if I needed anything. I appreciated having space to grieve in my own way, to mark this private milestone without performance or explanation. By evening, I felt emptied out but also lighter, like I'd honored something important. My first major project since returning to work wrapped up the following week. I'd been slowly rebuilding my confidence and workload, and this project felt like proof I could handle my job again. My manager called me in for our quarterly review meeting, and she praised the quality of my work and attention to detail. She mentioned increased responsibilities in the next quarter, potentially leading a small team on a new initiative. I felt a surge of confidence that I could handle more, that everything that had happened hadn't broken my ability to be good at my job. Walking back to my desk after the meeting, I realized I was starting to see a future again, instead of just surviving each day. A thick envelope arrived at my studio apartment 3 weeks later, with a law firm's return address, and I opened it standing in my kitchen to find a typed letter from William's lawyer. The apology was brief and formal, stating that William regretted the incident at the hospital and acknowledged his behavior was inappropriate during a difficult time. I read it twice looking for anything that felt genuine, but the language was clearly drafted by his attorney to satisfy the protective order requirements rather than coming from any real remorse. The letter mentioned nothing about the baby we lost or the months of emotional neglect that led up to that night. I folded it back into the envelope and filed it in the folder with all the legal documents, feeling nothing except maybe relief that I didn't feel obligated to respond. Gardenia had talked with me about how forgiveness isn't something I owe anyone, especially not someone who hurt me, and then apologized only because a judge made him. I closed the file drawer and went back to making dinner, surprised by how little the letter affected me compared to how much William's opinion used to matter. May mentioned over lunch the following week that her coworker had a friend who was recently single and wondering if I'd be interested in meeting for coffee. I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety, but also curiosity about whether I was ready to even think about dating again. May was careful not to push, saying it would just be casual and low pressure, maybe just a chance to practice talking to someone new. I agreed mostly because I trusted May's judgment and figured I could handle one coffee without it meaning anything serious. The guy's name was Jason, and we met at a cafe near the park on a Saturday afternoon, sitting outside at a small table. He was nice enough and we talked about work and hobbies and the city, but I kept noticing how I wasn't nervous or excited, just going through the motions of polite conversation. There was no spark or connection beyond basic friendliness, and I could tell he felt the same way. We finished our coffee after about an hour and said it was nice meeting each other, both of us clearly relieved there was no pressure to pretend otherwise. Walking back to my car, I felt okay about the whole thing instead of disappointed or worried that something was wrong with me. I was learning to trust my instincts about people and not force connections just to prove I was moving on from William. Some coffee dates are just coffee dates, and that's perfectly fine. That evening, I took out my journal from the drawer beside my bed and flipped to the letter I'd written to the baby months ago. I lit the candle I kept on my nightstand, the same one I'd used before, and sat cross-legged on my floor reading the words I'd poured out about hopes and dreams and sorrow. The grief washed over me again, but it felt different now, less sharp and overwhelming, more like something I could hold without it destroying me. I let myself cry without trying to stop or analyze why or tell myself I should be over it by now. The tears came and I sat with them, remembering the tiny life that had existed inside me for 11 weeks, and all the future moments we'd never have together. The candle flickered in the quiet of my apartment, and I felt the weight of the loss, but also the strength of having survived it. The grief hadn't disappeared and probably never would completely, but it had changed shape into something I could carry alongside the rest of my life, instead of something that crushed me under its weight. I closed the journal and blew out the candle, feeling emptied out but also somehow lighter. 6 months after that terrible night in the ER, I was sitting in my own apartment on a Friday evening with my laptop open, finishing up some work emails. The protective order against William was still in place with 4 months remaining, and I hadn't heard from him since his lawyer's letter. My bank account showed steady paychecks and growing savings, proof that I could manage my finances independently without anyone else controlling them. May had texted earlier asking if I wanted to grab dinner tomorrow, and I had regular therapy appointments with Gardenia every other week that helped me process everything. My manager had given me more responsibility at work, and I was handling it well, my confidence slowly rebuilding after months of feeling like I couldn't trust my own judgment. The studio apartment was small, but it was mine, with locks only I controlled and furniture I'd chosen, and a safety I'd built intentionally, rather than by accident. I wasn't all the way healed and probably never would be completely, carrying the grief of losing my baby and the scars from William's treatment. But I was safe now, supported by people who actually cared about my well-being, and learning that being okay was enough to build a future on. The life I was creating wasn't perfect or dramatic or tied up with a neat bow, just stable and mine and moving forward one day at a time. My boyfriend said he wanted an open relationship, so I opened it up to his family tree. I was sitting across from Lorcan on our 5-year anniversary when he took out a velvet box and tossed it across the table. Look, I'm down to get married, but I need freedom to explore. There's so many beautiful women out there, he continued, and I need to experience them before I die. I stared at the Rolex on his wrist, his Gucci belt, all paid for by me while he got his shit together. Here's what Lorcan didn't know. I'd spent our entire relationship lying to him. See, Lorcan was like medium ugly at best, and he has a micro PP. Yes, you heard me right. 0. 5 inches. But my love language is words of affirmation, so I spent 5 years telling him size doesn't matter. I made him feel like he was incredible when he really, really wasn't. And now he actually believed it. You know what? You're absolutely right, I said. His head snapped up. See? This is why I love you. You get it. He reached across and squeezed my hand, already looking at a woman walking past our table. This is going to be amazing for us. I smiled back. He had no idea what was coming. Within a week, Lorcan was a different person. New cologne that he bought in 5 installments with Klarna. He'd sit on the couch next to me swiping through dating apps, showing me photos of women. This one wants to meet up Thursday, he'd say. You should try too. Oh wait, you're probably too shy for this lifestyle. I just nodded, because I had my eyes on a prize too. And after 2 weeks of Lorcan posting other girls on his Instagram story, his mom finally texted me about the family barbecue. You'll still come, won't you? His brother Jack and I both want you there. I wouldn't miss it, I said, and I meant it. At the barbecue, Jack was at the grill in a shirt that he probably paid for by himself. He smiled when he saw me. That genuine smile that made you feel like you mattered. Hey, he said. I heard about the open relationship thing. You doing okay? I stepped closer. Actually, I'm doing great. Lorcan wanted freedom. I'm just taking the same deal. His expression shifted. Oh yeah? We talked for an hour. Laughed. His hand brushed mine. Across the yard, Lorcan was watching us, his conversation dying mid-sentence. His mom came over and hugged me. I always thought you were too good for Lorcan anyway, she whispered. But here's the thing. While Lorcan was posting all these club photos and collecting phone numbers, his actual dates weren't going well. He'd come home early every time. Thursday night, home by 9. Friday night, same thing. He was getting quieter. The confidence was cracking. 2 weeks later, I was getting ready to go out when Lorcan walked into our bedroom. "Where are you going?" His voice was different, uncertain. "I have a date." "Oh." He sat on the bed. "Anyone I know?" I looked at him in the mirror. "Yeah, Jack." His face went white. "Jack? My brother Jack?" "Yep, that's not funny." "I'm not joking." I grabbed my purse. "You said anyone. No restrictions, remember?" "I didn't mean my brother. You said whoever I want. I want Jack." I headed for the door. "You're being really insecure right now. I thought we were exploring. This is different. You can't." "Can't what?" I turned around. He opened his mouth. Closed it. He was trapped. "That's what I thought," I said. "Jack and I went to a nice restaurant where he asked about my life and actually listened. I've wanted to ask you out for 5 years," he admitted. "But you were with my brother." I posted a photo of us that night. Lorcan viewed it on all 3 of his accounts. The text started at midnight. "We need to talk. You're doing this to hurt me." After that, I started spending the nights at my best friend's house and didn't see him again until the next family dinner 3 weeks later. When Jack and I walked in holding hands, his mom practically ran over. "Oh, I'm so glad you two finally got together." She hugged us. Jack has been talking about her for years. Years. But she was with Lorcan and he'd never do that to his brother. Lorcan sat through dinner silent while everyone gushed about Jack and me. His aunt kept saying things like, "Finally someone with a real career," and Jack always treated his girlfriends well, not like, before trailing off and glancing at Lorcan. After dinner, Lorcan followed me to the kitchen. "Can we talk?" His voice was small. "Please. I'm kind of busy. Please." His eyes were red. I made a mistake. "The open relationship isn't working." "That's rough," I said. "But my brother? Really? You said whoever I want." "I'll close the relationship," he said coldly. "We'll go back to normal. Just us. Like it was. That's not an ask. That's a warning." I stared, not knowing what he meant. The way he looked at me made my skin crawl. My phone buzzed in my pocket and Chelsea's name lit up the screen asking if I was okay since I'd been in the kitchen so long. I typed back that I needed to come over right now and grabbed my jacket from the coat rack. Lorcan blocked the doorway, but I pushed past him and told Jack I had to go handle something urgent. His mom hugged me goodbye while Lorcan stood there watching with his arms crossed. The drive to Chelsea's apartment took 20 minutes, and she was already waiting at the door with wine and her laptop open. I told her everything about the kitchen and his weird threat about closing the relationship. She started typing notes immediately and said we needed to document everything because that sounded like coercion. She pulled up a new document and had me repeat his exact words while she typed them with timestamps. We saved screenshots of all our text conversations from the past 3 weeks, including his messages about wanting an open relationship. Chelsea said this was important evidence if things got worse and I should keep records of everything from now on. The next morning, I woke up early and drove back to our apartment while Lorcan was at the gym. I went through every drawer and folder collecting receipts for things I'd bought him over the years. The Rolex receipt was in my jewelry box where I'd kept it after surprising him for his birthday. His Gucci belt receipt was in my email along with dozens of clothing orders from Nordstrom and Saks. I found rent payments going back 3 years, showing I'd paid 70% every single month. Grocery receipts filled an entire shoebox because I'd been buying all our food since he was between jobs for 2 years. My credit card statements showed restaurant bills, vacation expenses, and even his car insurance payments. I spread everything out on Chelsea's dining table and used her calculator to add it all up. The total came to $32,400, and seeing that number made me feel sick. I took photos of every single receipt and uploaded them to a cloud folder Chelsea helped me create. Then I texted Jack saying we needed to talk about boundaries with his family situation. He replied immediately and suggested meeting for coffee that afternoon at a place near his office. When I got there, he was already waiting with my usual order ready. He listened while I explained about Lorcan's behavior and said he understood if I needed space from his family drama. Jack promised to support whatever I needed and wouldn't pressure me about family events. He also mentioned that Lorcan had been calling him non-stop complaining about me, but he wasn't engaging with it. We agreed to keep our relationship separate from whatever was happening with his brother. Later that day, Lorcan posted a black and white photo of himself looking sad with text about fake people showing their true colors. I took a screenshot immediately and added it to my evidence folder without responding or even liking it. Chelsea came home from work and said I should really see a lawyer about our shared lease and getting my money back. She had a friend at a legal aid clinic who helped people with domestic situations and could see me later this week. I called and made an appointment for Thursday morning. 2 days passed with my phone constantly buzzing from Lorcan's messages. First, he sent long paragraphs about how much he loved me and made mistakes. Then he switched to angry texts about Jack being a terrible brother who betrayed him. I only responded to practical things like the electric bill being due and needing him to transfer his half. Every message I sent was short, and I screenshotted everything, including his responses. On Wednesday morning, Dean from HR called me into his office. Someone had made an anonymous complaint about my workplace behavior, claiming I was creating a hostile environment. I explained that my ex was harassing me and trying to cause problems at my job. Dean took notes and said they take retaliation seriously and would investigate the complaint thoroughly. He asked if I felt safe, and I said yes, but wanted it documented that this started after I ended things with Lorcan. Thursday's appointment at the legal clinic went better than expected. The advisor looked through all my documentation and receipts and explained my options clearly. She said I could pursue getting the money back through small claims court for anything that was a loan, not a gift. She also explained how to get off the lease if Lorcan couldn't afford the apartment alone. We spent an hour drafting a formal separation agreement that said Lorcan could keep the actual gifts like the watch and clothes, but he needed to pay back money for rent, groceries, and bills that were clearly loans to help him out. The agreement gave him 6 months to pay back $20,000 in monthly installments. She said this was generous since I could prove more, but it showed I was being reasonable. That afternoon, I sent the separation agreement to Lorcan's email with a read receipt turned on. The email said he had 1 week to respond before I would file in small claims court for the full amount. The read receipt showed he opened it within 3 minutes, but he didn't reply for hours. Around 7 that night, I was watching TV with Chelsea when the buzzer for her apartment went off over and over. Someone was pressing every button in the building trying to get in. Chelsea looked at the security camera on her phone, and there was Lorcan standing outside pressing buttons like crazy. My stomach dropped. He must have gotten her address from my work directory or something. Chelsea told me to stay quiet while she went to the intercom. Someone from upstairs had already buzzed him in, though. We heard footsteps running up the stairs and then pounding on Chelsea's door. "I know you're in there!" Lorcan was yelling and hitting the door, so hard the frame was shaking. I pulled out my phone and started recording while Chelsea grabbed hers to call building security. He kept pounding and yelling about needing to talk to me and how I was ruining everything. The whole hallway could probably hear him screaming about his brother and his life, and how this wasn't fair. I kept recording everything while Chelsea talked to security on the phone. Within maybe 5 minutes, 2 security guards showed up and we could hear them in the hallway telling Lorcan he needed to leave. He started yelling at them too about how I stole his brother and ruined his life and turned everyone against him. The guards weren't having it and basically dragged him toward the elevator while he kept screaming. Chelsea opened the door once they got him in the elevator and we talked to the guards. They took our statements about what happened and said they were banning him from the property. One guard wrote up official documentation about the incident and gave us copies. They said if he came back, they'd call the police immediately. My phone was blowing up with texts from Jack asking if I was okay. Lorcan had called him right after getting kicked out and was screaming about betrayal and threatening to tell their parents the truth about me. I texted Jack back that I was fine and had nothing to hide, unlike his brother who'd been living off my money for years. Jack said Lorcan sounded completely unhinged on the phone, and he was worried about what he might do next. I told him about the security incident and sent him the video I took. The next morning, I woke up to an Instagram message from someone named Melanie Yates. She'd sent screenshots of her text conversation with Lorcan from when they went out. In the messages, he was telling her he was basically single and in a dead relationship. She said when they met up, he couldn't perform at all, and then spent 20 minutes blaming it on stress from his toxic relationship with me. I thanked her for reaching out and explained briefly that we'd been in an open relationship that he demanded. She was completely disgusted and said he'd lied to her from the start. She offered to give a statement if I needed it for any legal stuff. I saved all her screenshots to my evidence folder. That afternoon, Lorcan finally sent his response to the separation agreement. It was this long, crazy email about how I'd manipulated him for years and turned his whole family against him. He said I was emotionally abusive and controlling, and that I'd planned this whole thing to steal his brother. He refused to sign anything and demanded that I move out of the apartment immediately since he needed his space. I forwarded it straight to my lawyer friend from the clinic. She helped me write a response pointing out that I was the primary person on the lease and had been paying most of the rent for years. The records showed I paid 70% of rent every month plus all the utilities. We gave him 30 days to find somewhere else to live or agree to the payment plan. She said his email actually helped our case because it showed he was being unreasonable. That night, his mom called me crying. Lorcan had told her I'd been emotionally abusing him for years, and she didn't know what to believe. I stayed calm and told her I had documentation of our whole relationship, including all the bank statements showing how much money I'd spent supporting him. She went quiet for a long time, and then said she needed time to think about everything. I could tell she was starting to see through his lies, but didn't want to believe her son would make all this up. 2 days later, I had my counseling appointment that I'd scheduled weeks ago. The therapist asked why I'd stayed so long with someone who didn't appreciate me or contribute anything. We talked about my childhood and how my parents always made me feel like I had to earn love by taking care of people. She helped me see this pattern of needing to be needed, and how Lorcan had used that against me. It was hard to hear, but I knew she was right. The session helped me understand why I'd put up with so much for so long. Later that week, I started getting calls from Klarna because Lorcan's payments were bouncing. They had me listed as an emergency contact from when he'd signed up for all those payment plans. Every company he owed money to was calling me because his bank account was empty. I gave them his new phone number and went through the process of removing myself from all his accounts. It took hours to untangle myself from all his financial messes, but I needed to protect my credit. Each company confirmed they'd removed me and would only contact him going forward. That same night, Jack texted asking if I wanted to grab dinner at this small Italian place downtown. I met him there after work, and we sat in a corner booth away from the windows. He ordered us wine, and we talked about normal stuff at first, like his job and my promotion prospects. Then he got quiet and looked at me seriously. "We should probably talk about what this is," he said. I nodded and waited. He told me he'd watched Lorcan treat me badly for years, but never knew how to say anything without overstepping. He admitted seeing me pay for everything while Lorcan sat around made him angry, but it wasn't his place to interfere. We agreed to take things slow and not put labels on anything yet. The next morning, I woke up to 3 Instagram messages from women I didn't know. They'd all matched with Lorcan on dating apps and wanted to share their experiences. The first one said he showed up 40 minutes late to their coffee date and spent the whole time talking about his ex who was threatened by his success with women. The second one said he tried to get her to pay for dinner because his card got declined. The third one sent screenshots of him asking to borrow money after one date. All 3 said he wouldn't stop talking about how his ex was crazy and controlling. I thanked them for reaching out and saved all their messages. That weekend, I decided to start moving my valuable items out of the apartment while Lorcan was at his new weekend job his uncle got him. Chelsea came over with boxes and we started packing up everything I could prove I'd bought. My laptop, jewelry, the expensive coffee maker, all the kitchen stuff I'd purchased, even the good sheets and towels. Chelsea kept watch by the window in case Lorcan came home early. We loaded everything into her car and took it to a storage unit I'd rented. The whole process took 3 hours and we made 4 trips. Monday morning, I called Colin White, our landlord, to discuss the lease situation. He agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near his office. I brought copies of all the rent payments showing I'd been covering most of it for years. Colin looked through everything and shook his head. He told me Lorcan was already 2 months behind on his portion, which I'd been covering without realizing. Colin agreed to remove Lorcan's name at the lease renewal in 3 months if the missed payments continued. He also said he'd been getting complaints about loud music and parties from Lorcan's unit since I'd been staying elsewhere. I thanked him and got everything in writing. 2 days later, my bank app sent an alert that someone tried to access our joint savings account. I'd already moved my portion to a separate account the week before, leaving only Lorcan's contributions, which totaled about $200. My phone started buzzing with angry texts from him saying I stole his money. I reminded him the remaining balance was only what he'd put in over 5 years. He kept texting that I was a thief and he'd call the police. I screenshot everything and didn't respond after that. The next morning, I saw his aunt had posted on Facebook about women who gold dig and then play victim when the relationship ends. It was clearly about me, even though she didn't use names. Within an hour, Jack had commented defending me, saying some people work hard while others mooch off their partners. His mom jumped in supporting Jack. Soon half the family was arguing in the comments. I stayed completely out of it and just watched the drama unfold. My counseling appointment was that afternoon and we spent the whole session talking about honesty. The therapist pointed out I'd been lying to myself as much as I'd lied to Lorcan. She helped me see that I'd convinced myself his laziness was temporary and his lack of contribution would change. We talked about how being honest with myself meant recognizing my own worth and not settling for someone who didn't value me. It was hard to hear, but I knew she was right about everything. That night, I got a message from Alexa Figueroa with laughing emojis. She'd gone out with Lorcan the previous week and it was a disaster. He showed up late without his wallet and asked her to cover drinks. Then he spent the entire date talking about his crazy ex who was jealous of his success. He tried to invite himself back to her place and got mad when she said no. She said he mentioned me at least 15 times and kept showing her old photos of us to prove how happy he used to be. I thanked her for the warning and added her messages to my growing collection of evidence. By Thursday, I was done playing nice. I sat down and drafted a final email to Lorcan with clear demands. Move out within 45 days. Pay back the $5,000 he owed in monthly installments. Stop contacting me directly or through other people. I CC'd Colin, the landlord, and my legal advisor from the clinic. I included consequences this time, like eviction proceedings if he didn't leave, and small claims court for the money. I sent it Friday morning and waited. His response came Monday, but not by email. I was at my desk when Dean from HR called saying someone was in the lobby demanding to see me. I knew immediately it was Lorcan. Dean went down to handle it while I stayed at my desk. 20 minutes later, Dean called to say security had removed Lorcan from the building after he started yelling. They filed a formal no-contact order and put his photo at all security desks. Dean said HR was treating this as a safety issue and asked if I needed any other support. I thanked him and went back to work knowing I had another layer of protection now. 2 days later, Jack's mom called me while I was making dinner, and her voice sounded different. Softer somehow. She told me she'd been talking to other family members about everything that happened, and they all confirmed what she'd started to suspect about Lorcan's pattern of blaming everyone else for his problems. She admitted she'd always known he was irresponsible, but kept hoping he'd grow up if she just gave him enough time and support. I stirred my pasta while she talked about how she'd watched him go through job after job, always with some story about a bad boss or unfair treatment. She said she should have seen the signs when he moved back home 3 times before meeting me, each time with a different excuse about roommates or landlords being unreasonable. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, and by the end she was crying, saying she felt guilty for not protecting me from him sooner. That same week, I started getting messages from mutual friends who'd heard Lorcan's version of events. 3 different people reached out saying he'd been telling everyone I'd been cheating with Jack for months before we opened the relationship. They all said the same thing, though, that his timeline didn't make sense because he'd been posting about our anniversary dinner just weeks before claiming I'd been cheating for months. One friend sent me screenshots of Lorcan's messages where he contradicted himself about dates and details. Another friend who worked with Jack confirmed that Jack had been out of town for work during the time Lorcan claimed we'd started our affair. I saved all the screenshots in a folder labeled Evidence and kept documenting everything. The mediator Jasper Conrad called me Thursday morning to schedule our meeting at a coffee shop downtown for the following Monday. He explained the process would be neutral and focused on reaching a fair agreement about the apartment and finances. I agreed to the time and marked it in my calendar. Monday came and I arrived 15 minutes early, ordering a coffee and reviewing my documentation one more time. Jasper showed up right on time wearing a simple button-down shirt and carrying a leather folder. We shook hands and he explained we'd wait 10 more minutes for Lorcan before starting. 20 minutes passed before Lorcan finally walked in, wearing the Gucci belt I'd bought him for his birthday, and a designer jacket I recognized from my credit card statement 2 months ago. He didn't apologize for being late, just sat down and immediately started complaining about having to meet at all. Jasper stayed calm and pulled out paperwork, explaining we needed to discuss the apartment lease and any shared financial obligations. Lorcan slumped in his chair and admitted he couldn't afford the apartment alone since the rent was $2,800 a month, and his new job only paid him enough to cover maybe half that. He said he'd been trying to find a roommate, but nobody wanted to move in with the lease already in my name. Jasper took notes and suggested we work out a payment plan where Lorcan would have 60 days to either find a way to take over the lease or vacate the apartment. Lorcan's face got red and he started arguing that 60 days wasn't enough time, but Jasper reminded him that was already generous considering he hadn't paid rent in 2 months. I pulled out my folder and showed Jasper the documentation of Lorcan showing up at my workplace and Chelsea's apartment building. I explained how security had to remove him from my office, and how Chelsea's building had banned him from the property. Jasper wrote everything down in his notes, making sure to get specific dates and times. Lorcan suddenly got quiet and stopped arguing, his eyes darting between me and Jasper like he was just realizing how much evidence I'd collected. Jasper suggested we add a no-contact provision to the agreement, and Lorcan didn't object this time. We spent another hour going through financial details, with me showing bank statements proving I'd paid for almost everything during our relationship. Jasper calculated that Lorcan owed me close to $12,000, but suggested we settle for $5,000 in monthly installments to make it more realistic. I agreed because honestly I just wanted this to be over, and to have my freedom back without dealing with court proceedings that could drag on for months. Lorcan signed the agreement with shaking hands, agreeing to move out within 45 days and pay me $500 a month for 10 months. Jasper made copies for everyone and explained the agreement was legally binding and could be enforced through small claims court if necessary. After the meeting, I called Jack to update him and we talked about our situation. We both agreed it would be better to wait until after Lorcan moved out before being public about dating since we wanted to minimize drama and let things settle down. Jack said he understood completely, and that he'd rather do things right than rush into anything that might cause more problems. He pointed out that we'd already waited 5 years, so a few more weeks wouldn't matter, showing way more maturity than his brother ever had. Within days of signing the agreement, Lorcan started posting his designer items for sale online with sob stories about starting over after betrayal and rebuilding from nothing. I saw the posts because mutual friends kept sending me screenshots, but I didn't engage or respond to any of it. He listed the Rolex for half what I'd paid for it, and the Gucci belt for a third of its value, clearly desperate for quick cash. I focused on my own life instead, going to work, spending time with Chelsea, and slowly rebuilding my sense of self without his dead weight dragging me down. Chelsea came over the next weekend with paint samples and furniture catalogs, determined to help me reclaim my space. We spent Saturday painting the bedroom walls a soft blue color that Lorcan had always said was too feminine. Sunday we moved all the furniture around, getting rid of the ugly gaming chair he'd insisted on keeping in the living room, and replacing it with a reading nook I'd always wanted. We threw out his old posters and the stupid neon sign he'd bought for the kitchen that said, "Live, laugh, love," but ironically. By Sunday night, the apartment looked completely different, like a real adult lived there instead of a perpetual teenager. Chelsea helped me hang new curtains and arrange my books on the shelves I'd bought but never had room for before. The whole place finally felt like mine alone, not some compromise between what I wanted and what he'd tolerate. 2 weeks into the payment plan, my phone buzzed with a notification from my banking app showing a $500 deposit. I checked the transaction details and saw it was from Lorcan, right on schedule for the first payment. I forwarded the confirmation to my legal advisor at the clinic with a brief note acknowledging receipt, keeping everything professional and documented. There was no personal contact between us, just business through official channels, exactly how it should have been from the beginning if I'd been smarter about protecting myself. 3 days later, I came home from work to find Lorcan's key on the kitchen counter next to a folded piece of paper. The apartment felt different, emptier, with gaps on the shelves where his stuff used to be. I picked up the note and started reading something about how I'd destroyed his life and ruined his family relationships. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash without finishing it. The locksmith arrived within an hour and changed all the locks while I packed up the few things he'd forgotten into a box. I texted him that his stuff would be on the curb tomorrow morning and blocked his number again. That weekend, his mom called asking if I'd come to Sunday dinner because she still considered me family. I thanked her but said I needed some time to myself first. She understood and said the invitation would always be open whenever I felt ready. 3 weeks passed and I heard through mutual friends that Lorcan had moved back in with his parents. Apparently he was working at his uncle's construction company now, and telling everyone he was taking time to find himself after our toxic relationship. People who knew the real story just rolled their eyes when they heard his version. Jack texted asking if I wanted to try that Italian place downtown we'd talked about. We got a table by the window, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't look over my shoulder. He made me laugh telling stories about his coworkers and actually asked about my promotion at work. When the check came, he paid without making it weird or expecting anything in return. Walking back to my car, I realized this was what normal felt like. My counseling appointment that week focused on unpacking why I'd stayed so long with someone who didn't value me. We worked through my patterns of needing to be needed and how I'd confused being used with being loved. She helped me see that my worth wasn't tied to what I could provide for someone else. I left feeling lighter than I had in years. The next month, my banking app showed another $500 deposit from Lorcan. This time there was a note in the memo field saying he was sorry for letting his ego ruin something good. I screenshot it for my records but didn't respond. He didn't deserve my forgiveness or my acknowledgement. Chelsea surprised me the following weekend by inviting a bunch of our friends over for what she called my freedom party. Everyone brought wine and snacks, and we sat around my newly decorated living room sharing stories. Turns out most of them had noticed the problems, but didn't know how to bring it up without seeming like they were attacking my relationship. My friend from work admitted she'd wanted to shake me when I'd mentioned buying him another expensive gift last Christmas. We laughed and cried, and I realized I had an amazing support system. Jack and I had been seeing each other regularly for a month when we decided to make things official. We didn't announce it on social media or make some big declaration. We just quietly became a couple without any drama or family meetings. He brought me coffee at work sometimes, and I'd cook dinner at his place. It was easy and comfortable in a way things with Lorcan never were. We talked about real things, and he remembered details about my life. When I mentioned my dad's birthday was coming up, he suggested we visit together. The payments from Lorcan kept coming on schedule, and I kept documenting them through my legal advisor. When the final payment arrived, there was an email through my lawyer asking if we could meet for coffee to get closure. I had my advisor respond that I wasn't interested in meeting and considered the matter closed. My closure was my new life without him dragging me down. 6 months after he'd moved out, I was at the grocery store picking up ingredients for dinner with Jack. I turned into the cereal aisle, and there was Lorcan comparing generic brand prices with store brand. His designer clothes were gone, replaced with old jeans and a faded t-shirt. He looked up and saw me, his face going red. He started to say something about how I looked good and asked how I'd been. I politely said I was fine and needed to finish shopping. He stood there holding his basket of cheap groceries while I walked away feeling nothing but relief. Jack was waiting in the next aisle looking at pasta sauce and smiled when he saw me. We finished shopping together, him making jokes about my weird obsession with specific olive oil brands. At checkout, he insisted on paying even though it was my turn, saying he wanted to treat me. Driving home, I thought about how different everything was from a year ago. Back then, I was buying groceries for two while Lorcan sat at home swiping through dating apps. Now I had someone who contributed equally and actually appreciated what we had together. The apartment felt like home now, with my pictures on the walls and my books on every shelf. Chelsea had helped me paint the kitchen a soft yellow that made the whole space feel warm. Even my plants were thriving now that I had energy to take care of them. Work was going better too, since I wasn't stressed about money or dealing with Lorcan's constant drama. Dean had mentioned another promotion might be coming up, and I actually felt ready for it this time. The weekend Jack suggested we drive up to the mountains came 3 weeks later, and I packed my bag while looking at my organized closet that finally had space for just my things. We took his car up the winding roads and stopped at this little roadside stand where he bought us fresh apple cider without checking his bank balance first. At the cabin he'd rented, he carried both our bags inside and started a fire while I unpacked the groceries we'd bought together, splitting the cost without any weird tension about money. That night, we sat on the deck looking at stars, and he told me he'd watched Lorcan treat me badly for years, but didn't know how to say anything without seeming like he was just trying to break us up. He said he'd almost spoken up at Christmas 2 years ago when Lorcan made me pay for his parents' gifts, and then took credit for them. The next morning, we hiked to this waterfall, and he held my hand to help me over the rocks, even though I didn't really need help. Monday morning, Dean called me into his office and said the promotion paperwork was ready if I still wanted it. My new salary was almost double what I'd been making before, and Dean said I should have gotten this years ago, but I'd seemed too stressed and distracted to handle the extra responsibility. The first thing I did was update my direct deposit information to my new savings account that didn't have anyone else's name on it. 3 weeks into my new position, my team threw me a little celebration lunch, and everyone kept saying how much calmer and more focused I seemed lately. My birthday came 2 months later, and Jack's mom sent me a card with pressed flowers inside, and a note about how she'd never seen Jack this happy in his whole life. She mentioned at the bottom that Lorcan had started therapy and was working on his issues, which made me feel weirdly satisfied knowing he was finally dealing with his problems instead of making them mine. The apartment hunting started in spring when my lease renewal came up, and I realized I could actually afford something nice in a better neighborhood closer to work. Jack came with me to look at places, and we found this amazing one-bedroom with huge windows and actual closet space on the third viewing. The landlord ran my credit and approved me immediately since my score had jumped up without Lorcan's missed payments dragging it down. Moving day came on a Saturday, and Jack showed up with boxes and packing tape at 7 in the morning ready to help. We loaded everything into the truck he'd rented, and by noon we were sitting on my new living room floor eating Chinese food straight from the containers. Chelsea came over that afternoon with a plant and a bottle of wine to celebrate my new place that was actually just mine. Setting up my home office in the spare corner felt amazing, knowing I could finally work from home sometimes without Lorcan interrupting to ask for money or attention. My bank app showed me something incredible 6 months after Lorcan moved out when I checked my balance and saw actual savings accumulating for the first time in years. I opened an investment account that week and put in my first deposit, feeling genuinely excited about planning for retirement and maybe buying my own place someday. The financial advisor at my bank said I was in great shape for someone my age once I explained I'd recently gotten out of a financially draining relationship. Planning my first dinner party in the new apartment felt like such an adult thing to do, and Chelsea helped me pick out serving dishes at the thrift store. Jack and I cooked together the day of the party, him handling the main course while I made sides and dessert from scratch. Our friends started arriving around 7, and everyone brought wine or flowers and kept commenting on how happy and relaxed I looked. Chelsea pulled me aside in the kitchen and said she'd never seen me this light and free, like I'd finally become the person I was supposed to be all along. Someone took a group photo that night, and when I looked at it later, I barely recognized myself, because I was actually genuinely smiling instead of forcing it. The 1-year mark from that anniversary dinner with Lorcan came faster than I expected, and Jack made reservations at this nice place downtown. He wore a suit he'd bought himself and picked me up with flowers he'd chosen because he knew I liked tulips better than roses. During dinner, he kept fidgeting with something in his pocket, and finally stood up right there in the restaurant and got down on one knee. The ring he pulled out wasn't huge or flashy, but it was exactly my style, and he'd saved for it himself without putting it on credit or asking anyone for help. He talked about building something real together based on respect and partnership, and actually being equals in everything. My hands shook as he slipped the ring on my finger, and everyone in the restaurant started clapping while I said yes over and over. We called his mom from the car, and she cried happy tears, saying she'd been hoping for this since the day she met me. Looking at Jack driving us home, I realized this was what real love felt like when it wasn't built on lies or financial dependence, but on genuine respect and honesty. And that's today's breakdown. Hopefully it gave you something practical to think about, not just a story to pass the time. If even one part stuck with you, that's a win. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.